Growing up, my 37F relationship with my mom Linda, 58F, was what most would consider normal. We weren't the kind of mother-daughter duo who shared everything, but we got along well enough. She was strict but not unreasonable, and while we had our disagreements, there was always underlying love and respect. My dad was more laid back, often acting as the mediator when Mom and I butted heads over typical teenage stuff. Everything changed dramatically when I was 19 and met my now husband Greg at college. We clicked immediately and moved in together after dating for 6 months. This was around the same time my mom started getting heavily involved with an evangelical church through her coworker. The change in her wasn't gradual, it was like someone flipped a switch. She went from being relatively moderate in her views to extremely conservative almost overnight. The moment she found out Greg and I were living together, she completely lost it. She started showing up at our apartment unannounced, crying and pleading with me to move back home before I destroyed my life. She said we were living in sin and that I was breaking God's heart. When that didn't work, she began sending her church friends to talk to me. They would leave pamphlets about purity and salvation in our mailbox and try to corner me when I was alone. The pressure to get married became intense. My mom told everyone at church to pray for my soul, and the pastor even called me directly to discuss the importance of marriage before cohabitation. It got to the point where I couldn't take it anymore. Greg and I had already talked about marriage, but we wanted to wait until after graduation. However, to get my parents off our backs, we decided to have a small wedding when I was 20. I thought getting married would make things better, but it only changed the focus of my mom's pressure. The day after our wedding, she started talking about grandchildren. She became obsessed with the idea of me becoming a mother, constantly sending me articles about how waiting too long to have children was against God's plan. She would quote Bible verses about being fruitful and multiplying at every family dinner. What she didn't know was that Greg and I had actually started trying for a baby right after getting married. Month after month went by with negative pregnancy tests. After a year with no success, we started seeing doctors. The first doctor said we were young and should just keep trying. The second suggested some basic fertility tests but couldn't find anything obviously wrong. The third finally diagnosed me with unexplained infertility and suggested we consider more aggressive treatments. Over the next 15 years, I went through 6 devastating miscarriages. Each one broke me a little more. The first time it happened, I was 12 weeks along and had already started dreaming about names and nursery colors. When I called my mom crying from the hospital, her response was that we needed to pray more and that maybe God was punishing us for living together before marriage. She actually suggested that my miscarriage was divine retribution for our past sins. The second miscarriage happened during a family Christmas gathering. I started bleeding while helping Mom prepare dinner. Instead of taking me to the hospital, she insisted we pray over me first. My Aunt Jane, who thankfully was there, ended up driving me to the ER while my mom stayed behind to lead a prayer circle. After that, I stopped telling her about my pregnancies until they were further along. Each subsequent loss was met with similar reactions from her. She would say things like God must have a special plan for us, or maybe we weren't ready to be parents yet. Never once did she just hold me and let me cry. Instead, she would lecture me about how if I had been more involved in church, things might be different. She even suggested once that my infertility struggles were happening because I hadn't properly repented for my premarital living situation. 2 years ago, after exhausting every other option, Greg and I decided to try IVF. We had spent years saving for it since insurance wouldn't cover the treatments. We initially kept it private, telling only my Aunt Jane, who had always been supportive. However, at a family reunion, Jane accidentally mentioned our upcoming egg retrieval in front of my mom. You would have thought I had announced I was joining a satanic cult from my mom's reaction. She pulled me aside and spent an hour lecturing me about how IVF was against God's will. She said we were trying to play God and that if we were meant to have children, it would happen naturally. When I tried to explain the medical process to her, she covered her ears and started praying loudly. After that disaster, she would change the subject anytime I brought up our fertility journey. The first 2 rounds of IVF failed miserably. Each time, my mom said it was a sign we should stop trying to force something that God didn't want for us. During our second failed cycle, she even suggested that maybe God was protecting us from having a baby that would have birth defects because it was conceived unnaturally. I was so hurt by her attitude that I told her I wouldn't share any more updates unless she could be supportive. She didn't contact me about it for 2 months after that. This fall, our 3rd round of IVF was successful. After everything we've been through, I was terrified of getting excited too early. But at 11 weeks, my doctor said things looked good and I could start telling family. I really wanted to tell my parents in person, so I texted them asking if we could get together for dinner. My dad immediately responded with excitement, but my mom claimed she was too busy with church activities and work. After trying to coordinate for several days with no success, I decided to share the news in our family group chat. My dad called me within minutes, crying happy tears and telling me how proud he was that we hadn't given up. My mom, however, didn't respond at all. 3 days went by with complete silence from her, even though she was actively posting on Facebook about church events and sharing religious memes. Greg, seeing how much her silence was hurting me, finally texted her expressing our disappointment. She responded to him but not me, saying she didn't know how to respond, so she was praying about it. She also tried to turn it around on us, claiming we purposely keep her out of the loop so she ends up looking like the villain when she doesn't respond the way we want. Later that day she texted me saying she was busy until that afternoon but wanted to call. I was too hurt and angry by then, so I told her I needed space. I went ahead and shared the news with my extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents. Their reactions made my mom's silence even more painful. My Aunt Jane called me sobbing with joy, remembering how she had held my hand through all the miscarriages and failed treatments. My grandma immediately started planning a baby shower, asking about nursery themes. My cousins began sending me links to their favorite baby products. Meanwhile, my own mother couldn't even manage a simple congratulations. It's been a week now and I'm struggling with how to move forward. I always dreamed my mom would be a central figure in my child's life, but now I'm realizing that may not be possible. How can I maintain a relationship with someone who can't even pretend to be happy about something this important? I've started to accept that I may need to keep her at arm's length to protect myself and my baby from her judgment and negativity. The thought breaks my heart, but I need to prioritize my mental health and my baby's well-being over her religious convictions. Update 1, it's been about a month since my original post. A lot has happened, and I need to get it off my chest. The situation with my mom has gotten significantly worse than I could have imagined. After 3 weeks of complete silence, my mom finally reached out. But instead of the congratulations I had hoped for, she sent me a 5-page email that made my blood boil. She started by saying she had spent these weeks in deep prayer and felt that God was leading her to warn me about the spiritual dangers of IVF. The email began with several Bible quotes about children being a gift from God. Then she went into a detailed explanation of why she believed IVF was morally wrong. She claimed that by creating multiple embryos, we were playing God and potentially ending lives since not all embryos would be used. She wrote that each embryo was a soul in God's eyes, and by allowing some to be frozen or used for research, we were committing murder. What really got to me was when she started talking about divine punishment. She wrote that if anything went wrong with this pregnancy, it would be God's way of showing us we had chosen the wrong path. She even included links to articles about IVF babies having higher rates of birth defects, suggesting that this was proof of God's disapproval of the procedure. The email got worse as it went on. She said she had been discussing our situation with her prayer group, and they all agreed that she needed to take a stand against this sin. She wrote that she couldn't in good conscience celebrate this pregnancy because it came about through unnatural means. Then she had the audacity to suggest that I should consider adoption instead, saying at least that way I wouldn't be defying God's natural order. I was shaking with anger by the time I finished reading it. Greg found me crying in our home office and asked what was wrong. When I showed him the email, he wanted to drive straight to my parents' house and confront her. I had to talk him down, reminding him that confrontation would only make things worse. Instead, I forwarded the email to my dad. I knew he had been trying to understand why Mom was being so cold about the pregnancy, but I don't think he realized how extreme her views had become. He called me within minutes of receiving it. He was absolutely livid. He told me he had no idea Mom had such radical opinions about IVF. They had discussed it before, but she had never expressed such extreme views to him. The next day, my dad confronted Mom about the email. According to him, it turned into the biggest fight of their 40-year marriage. Mom doubled down on everything she had written, saying she was standing up for her religious beliefs. When Dad pointed out that many Christians support IVF, she accused him of not being a true believer. She even suggested that his support of my decision meant he was turning away from God. Dad couldn't take it anymore. He packed a bag and moved into their guest room, saying he couldn't sleep next to someone who would treat their only daughter this way. Mom apparently broke down crying, saying we were all ganging up on her for her faith. She called several church friends to come over and pray with her, turning our family crisis into a spiritual battle in her mind. The situation took an unexpected turn when my Aunt Jane came over to support Dad. During their conversation, she revealed something that shocked everyone. My mom had undergone fertility treatments herself before having me. According to Jane, Mom had trouble conceiving naturally and did several rounds of artificial insemination in the late 1980s. She had never told me this despite watching me struggle with infertility for 15 years. When Dad confronted Mom about this hypocrisy, she claimed that artificial insemination was completely different from IVF because it didn't involve creating extra embryos. She said God had led her to that treatment, but IVF was different because it involved playing with multiple lives. Dad asked her how she could justify withholding this information from me while I went through years of infertility trauma. She just kept repeating that the situations were different. The whole thing has spiraled beyond our immediate family. Mom has started telling people at her church about her IVF grandchild. She's painting herself as a martyr standing up for her beliefs against a family that doesn't understand her faith. Her church friends have taken it upon themselves to reach out to me. In the past week, I've received dozens of messages on Facebook from complete strangers telling me they're praying for my soul. One woman from Mom's church actually suggested I consider terminating the pregnancy and try to conceive naturally to make things right with God. Another sent me a lengthy message about how IVF babies often have spiritual and emotional problems because of how they were conceived. I've had to block over 30 people and make all my social media accounts private. My dad is still sleeping in the guest room and talking about needing space from Mom. He says this situation has made him question everything about their relationship and her faith. Part of me feels guilty for causing problems in their marriage, but another part is grateful that Dad is finally seeing Mom's religious extremism for what it is. I'm trying to focus on staying healthy and keeping my stress levels down for the baby's sake, but it's hard. Every time I think the situation can't get worse, it does. Greg has been my rock through all of this, reminding me that we're creating our own family and that's what matters most. My Aunt Jane and several cousins have also been incredibly supportive, making sure I know that Mom's views don't represent our whole family. Update 2. It's been 3 months since my last update, and the situation has gone from bad to worse. My mom has moved beyond passive-aggressive behavior to actively trying to sabotage my pregnancy journey and relationships with extended family. The past few months have been a constant stream of drama. Mom has been telling everyone who will listen that my baby isn't really her grandchild because it was conceived in a lab. She's been calling my aunts and cousins, trying to convince them that supporting my IVF pregnancy is the same as supporting abortion. She even told my grandmother that she should cancel the baby shower because celebrating an IVF pregnancy would be celebrating sin. Her campaign against me has gotten more organized. She convinced her pastor to reach out to me directly. He called me at work, saying he had concerns about the spiritual welfare of my unborn child. He offered to provide counseling to help me understand the moral implications of IVF, and suggested that Greg and I should make a public statement at church acknowledging our sin and asking for forgiveness. When I refused, he said the entire congregation would be fasting and praying for my baby's soul. Things reached a breaking point at my baby shower last week. My Aunt Jane and Grandma had organized a beautiful celebration at my grandma's house. Despite my protests, they invited Mom, hoping that seeing everyone's joy might help her come around. They couldn't have been more wrong. Mom showed up halfway through the shower with 3 women from her church's prayer group. At first, they just sat in the corner whispering among themselves. But when we started opening gifts, they sprang into action. They began handing out anti-IVF pamphlets to all the guests. These weren't just generic pro-life materials, they were specifically about the spiritual dangers of IVF, complete with graphic images and misleading statistics about birth defects in IVF babies. When my Aunt Jane tried to stop them, Mom started crying loudly about how no one was considering the baby's eternal soul. She attempted to lead everyone in prayer, asking God to forgive me for creating and destroying multiple embryos in my selfish pursuit of motherhood. She even brought up my past miscarriages, suggesting they were God's way of telling us to wait for natural conception. My grandmother, who is 82 and usually avoids confrontation at all costs, completely lost her cool. She stood up and told Mom that if she couldn't support her only daughter's happiness, she needed to leave immediately. Mom refused, saying she had a spiritual duty to save her grandchild from eternal damnation. That's when my Aunt Jane and 2 of my cousins physically escorted her and her church friends out of the house. After they left, we discovered more of what Mom had been saying behind my back. She'd been telling people that Greg and I had deliberately destroyed multiple viable embryos during IVF, completely false. We donated our extra embryos to research after careful consideration. She claimed we had rejected dozens of embryos because they weren't perfect, painting us as playing God by choosing which lives to save or destroy. She's also been spreading rumors that I had rejected faith and family values by choosing IVF over adoption. She told several family members that Greg and I had refused to consider adoption because we were too vain and wanted a biological child at any cost. In reality, we had looked into adoption years ago but were turned down by several agencies due to various factors including the religious requirements of some agencies. My dad, who is still living separately from Mom, finally lost all patience after the baby shower incident. He went home, packed more of his things, and told Mom he wants a separation. He said he can't be married to someone who would deliberately hurt their child this way. Mom responded by having her church friend stage a prayer intervention at his workplace, causing such a scene that security had to be called. The situation has divided our extended family. Most are supportive of me, but a few of Mom's more religious relatives have taken her side. My cousin Sarah, who had been trying to stay neutral, told me that Mom called her crying about how her family was being torn apart by my selfish choices. She's positioning herself as the victim in all this, claiming she's being persecuted for standing up for her religious beliefs. Update 3. It's been 6 months since my original post, and I'm now in my 3rd trimester. After the baby shower disaster, I made the difficult but necessary decision to go completely no contact with my mom. I blocked her number, email, and all social media. I also had to block dozens of her church friends who kept trying to reach me through different accounts. My dad is still living separately from Mom and has been an amazing support through all of this. He's been coming to all my doctor's appointments and has even started attending birthing classes with Greg and me when he can. He told me that watching Mom's behavior over these past months has made him realize how much her religious extremism has damaged our family. The most surprising development has been the ripple effect this situation has had on our extended family's relationship with Mom's church. My Aunt Jane, who had been attending there for over a decade, has switched to a different congregation that's more accepting. 2 of my cousins who were active in the youth ministry have also left. Even some of Mom's closest church friends have started distancing themselves from her. Last week, 3 women from her prayer group reached out to apologize for their part in ruining the baby shower. They said they had been misled about the details of IVF, and had done their own research. They admitted that Mom had manipulated them with incorrect information about the process, and about how Greg and I had handled our extra embryos. Dad says Mom has been showing some signs of wanting to reconcile. Apparently, she's started seeing a counselor from outside her church, someone Dad's therapist recommended. She's also stopped attending the prayer group that was involved in the baby shower incident. According to Dad, she broke down recently and admitted that she knows she's pushed me away. However, I'm not ready to let her back into my life. The things she said and done over these past months have caused too much damage. Her actions went beyond just disapproving of IVF. She actively tried to turn my family against me during what should have been one of the happiest times of my life. She tried to make me feel ashamed of the baby I fought so hard to conceive. I'm due in 8 weeks, and we've made it clear that Mom will not be allowed at the hospital or in my child's life unless she meets certain conditions. These include getting ongoing professional help, making genuine amends to everyone she hurt, and acknowledging that her behavior was wrong. I've also insisted that she needs to publicly correct the lies she spread about our IVF journey and how we handled our embryos. The nursery is almost ready, and looking at it reminds me of how different things are from what I imagined. I always pictured my mom helping me fold tiny clothes and sharing her motherhood wisdom. Instead, my Aunt Jane and grandmother have stepped into that role. They've been incredible, showing me what unconditional love and support really look like. This whole experience has taught me that sometimes the family you choose is better than the family you're born with. I'm grateful for the relatives who have stood by me, and I'm at peace with my decision to keep Mom at a distance. My priority now is protecting my baby from the kind of religious trauma and emotional manipulation I experienced. Maybe someday Mom will truly understand the harm she's caused and make real changes. Until then, I'm focusing on creating a loving, accepting environment for my child with the family members who have proven they deserve to be in our lives.